Hello and welcome. You're listening to Start Again with Shauna Lee, the place where you will be reminded that it's never too late and you're never too old to do the damn thing. So stick around if you're ready to vibe higher and be inspired to chase your dreams. Together, we will uncover your soul's truest desires. Now, if you're ready, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I have a new author to introduce you to, Dana S. Diaz. She has written a story that has come from her own experience. She has a background in journalism and psychology, and together they have come together to weave a beautiful story, one that has started from something we all know about, which is some trauma. So the book is titled Gasping for Air. And Dana, I just have to say thank you first for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to share, my whole journey because it certainly didn't start happy, but there is absolutely a happy ending.
Yes, and that is definitely a theme that we see in all of the stories that we hear here on the show. I'm anxious for us to dive in. So maybe let's just start with a little bit of your background. Tell everyone kind of where you are, where you're coming from, and specifically how I like to get this started is how have you embraced this idea of starting again?
Oh, there's a lot to unravel there. And I've actually written two more books that will join together with the first one and explain all of this. But, I my life and everything that has come to be basically started before I was even born. So I was born to an unwed teenage mother back in the 70s when it wasn't okay for teenagers to get pregnant, never mind have babies. So it wasn't a happy time for my mother. She endured a lot of shame, a lot of judgment, even within her own family. But she did decide to keep me. It was actually my grandma and great grandma that urged her to. They said no grandchild or great grandchild of theirs would be raised by strangers or aborted. So here I am, and I was the first grandchild and great grandchild to them. So I was very much loved by grandma and great grandma. Unfortunately, mom, not so much. She was always very kind of detached from me. I wonder if she even ever wanted children at all because she had her tubes tied immediately after I was born. And again, keep in mind, she was a teenager. And yes, they did tie her tubes right after I was
Wow.
born. So I just kind of put a wrench in her plans for life, I suppose. So she treated me as
Mhm.
such. I was often referred to as an accident. I was referred to as a
Oh,
mistake.
dear.
I never felt any kind of, motherly nature coming from her. She didn't soothe me. I certainly didn't feel protected or in any way that we had any real relationship. But unfortunately, when she did eventually get married, I was taken to go live with her and her new husband, who was an older man, quite older than her. But he had a house in the suburbs and he had a car and he had all these things that I know my mother, coming from the city and not having those things growing up, even within our own family. My grandma and great grandma had migrated from Puerto Rico. Um, so my mother sought this life. And it let's just say it seemed to me, even as a child, that this life was more important than our relationship. It was more important than me. I'm not even sure she was really happy, but she had everything she said she wanted, and she thought she could only have this with this man. This man, unfortunately, I didn't have a name for it when I was a child, but I could tell that he was a braggart. He knew everything. He had to be the best, be seen as the best, be perceived as having a much higher status than what he really held. In everything and above everybody, he was superior. He thought he was God, but he didn't believe in God. So there was a lot going on in that house.
Mhm.
He
Yes.
was verbally abusing me to start. He was very rough with me physically. I would stand up for myself because I was a tenacious little thing, and that would meet physical consequences. And as I got older and bigger, I got a little bolder, and my mouth got as big as I was, basically, and none of it served me very well. Mom just turned her head to it, pretended like it wasn't happening. She even turned it around on me most of the time, saying, well, if I didn't provoke him and if I didn't do this and that, and so everything was my fault. I certainly, even though I knew it was wrong, I internalized it. And, unfortunately, over the years until I was 18 and could leave on my own, I absolutely felt every bit of the worthlessness and the undeserving and everything everything that he said, that I wasn't wanted, I shouldn't exist, nobody's going to love me. And it's a
So
terrible thing
terrible.
to do to a child, never mind the eating disorder I developed because he constantly critiqued my body and what I ate, and I was maybe 100 pounds, so I don't even
Hmm.
understand that. It was disgusting. But looking back, the good part of this was I wanted to just go to beauty school. He made me go to college because beauty school wasn't real school. And in college, my counselors discovered that I could write and I could speak. So I just went with it because I still just wanted to go to beauty school. I didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
So I got my degree in communications, focusing on journalism. I minored in psychology. Um, Thought I could go to New York and be Barbara Walters or something. That never happened, though,
Yeah.
because I fell for a young man who is another narcissist that came across my path, but he was a different type. So as much as there was something unsettling about him the second I met him, it came at me differently. He wasn't as
Hmm.
direct as my stepfather was. This one was more, I always say he was like Eeyore. He kind of came at me with more of a poor me, like I'm always the victim and
Hmm.
nothing good ever happens. So I thought I could be his cheerleader and pump him up, and he seemed to like that. He seemed to like servitude. And it was a very dysfunctional relationship, but at the same time, it was the perfect storm because I was so desperate for somebody to love me and pay attention to me. And when I was a good girl, which he actually called me a lot of the time, if I was a good girl, I'd be told
Oh,
I was a
wow.
good girl, then I would get that love and attention. I would get those little treats of affection. And when I wasn't, well, then I met the consequences. But unfortunately, because of how I'd grown up, throwing things, slamming doors, waving crowbars and hockey sticks around didn't phase me like it would phase somebody who grew up in a healthy environment. So,
Yeah.
long and short of that is I spent 25 years with this young man. We married, we had a child. The abuse got worse. There were also multiple abuses that came into play. And for people that aren't familiar with narcissistic abuse, it's not its own form of abuse. It encompasses all abuses because a narcissist will use any and all types of abuses or tactics to basically keep their prey, the victim, isolated and keep them quiet and keep them basically controlled. So this will
Right.
be physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal, emotional, psychological, legal abuse, financial abuse. It's everything. And it comes at you every single day in various forms. So you don't have time to process one thing before another one hits you. So, the end of this story, if you want to know more about that marriage, that is what Gasping for Air, my book, is about that 25-year relationship. But the book actually came about towards the end of that marriage when we had gotten from point A, where things were just being thrown across the room, to point B, where we have guns and knives and police and death threats and all kinds of craziness going on. Obviously, it was not a good situation for me. I wanted out. I wanted my son out of there. But we were under the shelter in place for COVID, so I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't file for divorce. I was stuck in a house with a man who wanted me dead. So I moved to my basement. I slept on the couch down there. I used the laundry room, the sink in there for whatever I needed for water. I even had a little fridge down there. I just I just tried to stay out of the rest of the house if I could help it. But what I was also doing while I was down there was keeping track in a notebook of all the things that were going on, texts he was sending me, things he was saying. I mean, even if, sitting outside glaring at me, whatever it was, because I needed to have some kind of a record of what was going on in case he did succeed in doing something to me and making it look like I had self-inflicted the harm onto
Right.
myself. So that was where Gasping for Air came from. When I got out of that marriage, when the courts reopened and life went on, and even after the divorce, there were 2 incidents of domestic violence that I had to go to court and have the police and the courts involved in to get a restraining order, which only allowed him to stay 10 feet away from me, which I argued he
Mm.
could kill me from 10 feet away because I was only 93 pounds at that point. Um, that's when I decided I really needed to make people aware of what narcissistic abuse looks like, because to the rest of the world, we were going to the family functions, smiling,
Yeah.
and he'd have his arm around me and acting like everything was fine. Around our son, we were trying to act like we were just a regular mom and dad and sometimes didn't get along. My son didn't see anywhere near everything that really was happening behind the scenes, thank God. But even at school, we were showing up with cupcakes and hot dogs and going to the fundraisers
Yeah.
and events, acting like everything was fine. If something would have happened to me, nobody would have ever believed that he did anything to me because he was likable, he was charming, he was funny. Everybody just loved him. He was even coaching a team at the school. So,
Yeah, I think that's the piece that a lot of people do misunderstand,
yeah.
that it's by design to control their
Oh,
victim, and
100%.
to keep everything behind closed doors, so to speak, hidden. And the surface always looks different than behind closed
Yeah.
doors.
And I argue too. I mean, it was a friend that pointed it out, but we always say it's the narcissist wearing the mask, but you know what? So are the victims. We're all wearing it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's true. It's true. Well, so obviously that describes and answers my next question, which is what inspired you to write your book.
Yeah.
Um, so I believe I read in one of your intros that, it started as a journal hidden under your couch. And maybe take us through how you went from writing in a journal to quite literally save your life to realizing this could be a book, and what did that process look like for you?
Well, it was interesting because, again, it was during COVID. So, we weren't working, we had time on our hands. And I did not even, people have to understand the isolation. Narcissists like to make sure that they separate you from friends and family. They separate you from even working a lot of the time. They don't want
Yep.
anybody else to influence you. My then husband didn't like me going on the internet because the world was out there with information. He didn't like me reading.
Yep.
So I didn't read. I didn't even have a smartphone. I still had one of those little 3G slider phones where I could text and make
Hmm.
calls, but I was so limited. He had moved me even 90 miles outside of Chicago to some podunk city, rural farm town. Everybody knew everybody. But my goodness, did I not know anything about the world, even though I had traveled throughout the world prior to
Yeah.
him and
Yeah.
lived in the big city of Chicago and was exposed to all kinds of culture and people and arts and information. So I didn't even realize, believe it or not, that narcissism was a thing. I truly thought I was the only person that could possibly be
Yep.
experiencing this. As such, given the time on my hands, I naturally always wanted to write because that was the other thing with my journalism degree. Number one, in a podunk town, where am I? Walmart doesn't care that I have a degree in journalism. There's nowhere to use my
Yep.
degree. So I just had this idea like, let me take this journal because it was just like 2 or 3 sentences every day. I'm like, let me expand it out. Let me write some of these
Yep.
stories out, just thinking maybe one day somebody will read them. I never really understood this idea though. I've heard people, I went to church every Sunday. I've heard people say God spoke to them or God put something in their heart. And honestly, I
Hmm.
was just jogging. I was very healthy, before I got sick from the stress. And I was a runner. So I would jog 5 miles every morning. And I just remember one morning, something just came to me like, maybe this is a book. Maybe people would be interested to know, the perspective from inside the house of a narcissistic, relationship. So I wasn't sure. I mean, who was going to buy a book that I wrote? Who was going to even
Yeah.
think that, they could write a book? Like, who was I? I was nobody. But I just entertained myself. Again, during COVID, we all had time on our hands. We all did different things. So I just started really just expanding on these journal entries and kind of compiling them together. And when we came out of COVID and after the divorce and everything settled, I was like, no, you know what? Now that I have internet and a smartphone and I realize this is a thing, maybe somebody
Yeah.
would be interested. Maybe and I said to myself, even if one person was saved from the fate that I had to live, then that's all I want. I just don't want anyone else to ever go through this. So I started interviewing with publishers and kind of, revising the manuscript over and over. And it was a very long 3.5 year process, because even though you can write, I never actually wrote a book. So, it had to be written a
Right.
certain way for the audience, this and that, and restructured and, going through the process. But we finally got it. And I'm very proud of it. And it's sad actually to me that it's done so well, but it's definitely resonating with the right people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's serving an audience for sure. Well, what do you think surprised you most about your journey to becoming an author?
I think just, I mean, again, who thinks that they're ever going to have a book published? Like when I think
Yeah.
for me, like, as much as I talked about it, because I'm one of these people that feels like when you have a goal, you should let people know, because then people are like, oh, well, when's this book coming out? When are you going to?
Yeah. How's that coming?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it kind of keeps you on your toes and keeps you pumped and encourages you, because there were a lot of times where I questioned it. I'm like, what am I doing? Do I really need to do this? Do I really need the
Yes.
world to know? And
Yeah.
because there's shame and people have to understand too. I was trying to get through it. I was trying to heal. I was trying to
Hmm.
reset my nervous system, and I had become ill at the end of that marriage. That's all that stress I was in fight or flight mode for so long. I'd
Yeah.
actually become autoimmune and developed a lung disease as a result of it, which was another big part of wanting to share this information. So it was a lot.
Yeah. And, I don't think a lot of people talk about that
Right.
enough. I do my share of talking all the time about we need to pay attention to our bodies. And when there's
Yes.
an ailment, a disease, something not right, your body is talking to you. And it is essentially telling you what is going on emotionally that you haven't been paying attention to, or you're intentionally trying to shove down. And being in survival mode, this fight or flight response for extended this lengthy amount of time,
Yes.
it takes a toll on the body for
That's the
sure.
thing. People didn't understand that. And even now to this day, even people that have read the book, they look at me and this is all makeup. And, so, like they don't understand, like I remember just
Yeah.
even last week, I was so dizzy and out of breath and nauseous and feeling feverish and clammy because I had a 2 hour long podcast after already doing two other podcast interviews. I should have thought about that, because even I forget sometimes that I
Yes.
have a lung disease, but people don't understand. They just think, oh, she looks fine, so she must be fine. But it's like
Yeah.
narcissism. Oh, they look like a happy family, so they must be.
They
It's
must be.
it's
Yeah.
all smoke and mirrors. And so there are times when I really, have to think back, like, how sad was it that I ignored all the signs? Because even as a child, I had so many headaches and stomach aches, like more
Mm-hmm.
than any other kid. I was constantly in the nurse's office getting those little red and white mints because that's all they could legally give me to settle
Yes.
my stomach. But I look back and I'm like, that was my body, like
Yeah.
just holding all those emotions in because I couldn't tell anybody and
Yeah.
nobody would believe me. And even when child services got involved and police were involved in my childhood, I didn't even bother telling anybody because who was going to believe me? Just like I
Yeah.
still have people, even after my book has come out now, that tell me, oh, well, we know him. Your ex-husband wouldn't do that. We just think you're a
Oh my
vengeful wife.
goodness.
And you know what? I don't even care anymore. I don't know if it's age or just, I'm
Yeah.
just standing in my truth. I don't care what anybody believes. I know that I wouldn't be autoimmune if it weren't for him. My body, that cortisol, that stress hormone had been pumping through me for so long that my
Mm-hmm.
white blood cells thought they had to eradicate something big. They eradicated themselves, and that's how I became autoimmune. And I mean,
Yeah.
if you saw the varying symptoms, I had like 2 dozen symptoms. I discussed this in the book that I kept going to doctors and they kept wanting to give me a pill for this or that. And it's like, I don't want a pill. I want somebody to tell me what's wrong. And when I
Yeah.
dropped to 93 pounds in a 2 week period, almost 20 pounds, I mean, I was
Yeah.
skeletal and it was scary. It was scaring people to see me. But, here's the thing, and this is the point of all of this. It took me my whole life to finally figure out that, and let me backtrack even with this. We all have that deal breaker in a relationship. And I hear it all the time. Oh, if my ex cheat or if my husband cheated on me, if my wife did that, stole money from you say that, but believe me, you don't know what your real deal breaker is until it happens. Because
Yep.
that's the point where you say, I cannot possibly be with this person anymore. And for me, it was the point when I got sick because he had already drained us financially. He had already killed my soul. I mean, I was living a life like a Stepford wife, basically doing everything that he wanted. He dictated even the lipstick I wore and the clothes I could wear and how my hair, I mean, everything. And
Mm-hmm.
I had to wake up when I got sick and say, okay, am I going to let this man kill me without putting his hands on me? Am I going to just go out and that was it and my life was for nothing? Or am I going to stand up, have some damn self respect, and take back control of my life?
Yep.
And I wanted to live. I was always that healthy girl, and maybe I should be thanking my stepdad, who abused me in childhood and gave me an eating disorder, but my body was the deal breaker because
Yeah.
my health was always that thing that I was like, no, I was that girl that ate an apple and hard-boiled eggs for lunch and, always made sure to get that run in every day. I was not going to let him take my body and my health away from me. He did partially, but I stopped it before it got too far. So, yes, sharing that and the mind body connection, people need to know that because why do we stay in those relationships? There's a million reasons. I can get into
Mm-hmm.
the chemical and biological aspect of the trauma bond. I can get into just the plain old facts of who has extra money to support an entirely second household. I can get into the fact that we lived on a small farm and had cows and pigs and chickens and he traveled and did things and who is going to take care of these animals. It wasn't like we lived in some suburb in a house that we could just sell and
Yeah.
move on. It's not that simple. So
Yeah.
I think it's really necessary for us to realize that you think you're doing the noble thing, staying for the kids and keeping the family together,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
part of it was my faith, but at the end of the day, I'm much better off. And so was my son once I got out of that situation and he saw me thrive.
Yes. Oh, there's such value in that for our children and for us as well. Um, I saw something the other day and it said something along the lines, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the details, but it said something along the lines, we always ask, why doesn't she leave? But why aren't we asking, why is he treating her that way? Like, why
Thank
are
you.
we always putting the responsibility on the victim to be the one to be strong enough to leave? And we're not turning the focus to, why is this man treating her that way? And that
100%.
so came out in your story. Yeah. Well, so kudos to you for being strong
Thank you.
enough to stand up for yourself, for your son, and to tell the world about it. I mean, it's hard enough just to get the courage to leave, but then you went and wrote a whole damn book about it, which I am here for all day long. So good for you.
Thank you.
My next question though is, if you were to look back at the younger you, and you pick whichever age phase of life, what advice would you give her?
That one's easy for me because here's the thing about all this. Do I wish that I had been born to a completely different mother and lived a different life? Yeah, of course. I mean, who doesn't want a mom that actually loves them? That sucked. That was
Yeah,
pretty much
yeah.
the premise for the rest of my life and set me up wrongly, but I think that I'm one of these people that believes in the domino effect. I think if you go back and change anything, the slightest thing, then that just completely obliterates where you are now. And if I
Yeah.
hadn't lived my whole life up to now exactly the way it was, I would not be remarried to the most amazing man ever and be living very happily and healthy. And my son is really doing well, and I, life is good. Life is really,
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
It's everything I wanted it to be. So all I would do at any age, probably, although if I had to pick, I would probably say somewhere between like 12 and 13 and maybe 16 or 17. I would
Hmm.
just go back to that girl and say, it's going to be okay. Just
Yeah.
hang in there. It's going to be okay.
I love that. And I hear that a lot. That's one of my favorite questions to ask, because there is so much wisdom that comes out of it. But generally, it sounds a little bit like you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And
And we need to hear that. I mean, even
we
now, we
just need some
sometimes that's all
encouragement.
we
Yeah.
need. We
Yeah.
just need somebody to tell us that.
I work with women after divorce, and that's generally all they need to know, is that it's going to be okay. Because when you're facing something big and overwhelming or uncertain, like the biggest fear comes from the unknown, I have found.
Oh,
And
100%.
the what ifs um can spiral us, and just knowing that no matter what happens, you will be okay is generally what people need to hear. So I love that
Right.
that's what you would tell the younger you,
Well,
because it's true.
thank you. Cause yeah, I mean, cause I agree with you 100%. If I can just say, I mean, I wish I could tell that to everybody. My situation
Mhm.
may not be as dire as some, but yeah, at 45 years old, I was physically suffering. I was ill with a lung disease, wearing a backpack oxygen machine, autoimmune all of a sudden. I had a kid about to graduate high school and going off to college who had a deadbeat dad who, in the divorce, wanted nothing but his guns. He didn't want any part of his son, no custody, no financial responsibility, no nothing. And I was fine with that because with a narcissist, you just need to be rid of them. But yeah, you want to talk about scary. Now I have a mortgage all on
Mhm.
me, a
Yeah.
kid's tuition all on me, and I want to keep life as stable and consistent and steady for my son as possible so he doesn't have to experience any damage, so to speak, from the divorce.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
am here telling you, it was fine. It was more than fine.
Mhm.
And I didn't have help from anybody. I didn't have a mom or a dad that I could turn to for help. I didn't have anybody. And I did it. I paid in full for my son to go off to college. And when he came back with 5 job offers, he took one. He was paid very well for his age. At 19 years old, he bought his first house. He's never done drugs. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. Like all these things you hear, like kids of divorce suffer and it's going to be so
Mhm.
hard. It was okay. It was
Yeah.
okay. And here I was, a single mom, sick, and I made it work. And my son saw my bravery and he saw my resilience and he saw that I was not giving up. I was fighting for both
Yeah.
of us. And he now has those same characteristics. And I'm so proud of him.
I love that you mentioned that as well, because I think when women are contemplating leaving a marriage, that's one of the biggest, scariest things. How
Yeah,
am I going to pay for everything? How am I going to do this all by myself? And the laundry list of things that you have to learn how to do that you don't know how to do that are uncertain and scary. I mean, it is a long list. But the thing about it is, not only can you figure it out, because yes, you will, the massive amount of emotional turmoil that is removed when you remove yourself from that
yes,
relationship frees up all this emotional space, and this it gives you the ability to think more clearly, to figure things out. You it's this weight that is lifted from you that it makes all the other things, while hard and yes challenging and very difficult, it makes it easier to handle, and it makes it possible.
absolutely. Because
Hmm.
with him gone, and once we were over that hump of like, okay, the divorce was finalized and it was over,
Yeah.
honestly, my physical symptoms from my illness, those stress triggered symptoms, it's like somebody waved a magic wand over me. Even my son, after a week or two of his dad being moved out of the house, I remember him kind of looking around. He's like, the energy is kind of, and he's not one of those weirdos that talks about
Yes.
energy. And I don't mean to call
Yes.
anyone a
Yes.
weirdo, but he's a boy. He was a teenage boy, and he was like, "Oh, the
Mm,
energy is like different here. It's like it's." And I'm like, "Yeah, you don't feel that tension and that hostility in the
exactly.
air. Like it just sucked the life out of everybody."
Yep.
And it is gone, and you can breathe literally and figuratively. You can
Yes.
breathe, and you don't have that cloudiness. You can focus, you can
Exactly.
think, you can, and stuff gets done and stuff follows. And, this was my story, but I mean, I've heard a million other stories of women who have suffered in domestic violence situations and just horrific things I've heard. But there's one in particular, and I won't share her entire story, but just to give people perspective, this woman, she's about my age. It was about 2 years ago, I want to say. She left an abusive marriage with two boys. I believe they were 10 and 12 at the time. Both boys are autistic, both.
Mm, mm-hmm.
They lived
Mm-hmm.
on the streets. They had
Wow.
nothing. I remember
Yeah.
all she could barely keep a hold of was her phone. And I remember her sending me a message one day saying that all that they could find to eat in the garbage was one piece of toast that they had to share between the three of them all day. They are doing phenomenal now. She made it because you know what? Every community, and I don't care where you live in this world, because she does not live in the States, there are resources. There are good people in this world who will make sure you have shelter. They will make sure to help you get back on your feet. You will have food. You will have clothing. You can even have your pets removed from the abusive home and fostered until you're able to take them back in again. So,
Mm.
if
That's a really good point. I don't think a lot of people even think about that being an option.
yes, and I wouldn't have either, and I wish I would have known that because one thing that did not make it into my book because my book was already so full, it was about double the size it should have been, but one thing was I did have a bloodhound who was epileptic and she developed lymphoma.
Oh.
I needed to give her 24-hour care, and he was awfully cruel to her, because he said I loved her more than I loved him, which I did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll be
Mm-hmm.
honest. um, but I mean, I would not leave her there. And I didn't have a
Yeah.
place to go, or at least I didn't think I did, where I could take not just a dog, but a sick dog who, let's be real. If you've ever seen a dog seize, and she'd have grand mal seizures several times a day, things come oozing out of all ends, and it gets very
Yeah.
messy and ugly and awful. So I stayed. I had to stay. I was not leaving her at all, and I was not leaving my son.
Yeah. Well, yes. And you're right. There's so much of all of our stories that we can't possibly cover all the nuances and details. But
Right.
that was a very good point to bring up for anybody who's listening who is worried about their pets. That there is, this is what I always say, regardless of the situation you're looking at, there is always an option, and
There
you can
really is.
always choose different.
Exactly.
And I just find that it gives us our power back. It gives us some control. It gives us some sense of like, okay, hold on, maybe I can do this, which I think in those situations is all people need is a little tiny sliver of hope that they can do it.
Right.
So you're an excellent example of that.
Thank
So
you.
when you look forward, though, what is next for you? What do you now believe is possible for your own life?
Well, it's interesting. I never imagined I could possibly write a book and actually have it published. And
Yeah.
I did. I did it last year. So I actually have two more books that also came from journals that I kept. One is about my childhood and growing up with that whole situation, and the other one is more about what has happened since that last marriage, since gasping for air, because there is a lot to be said about the healing process. And, especially coming from a situation in my childhood and then in a marriage where I never felt like I belonged. I never felt like I was good enough. I mean, there is so much to unravel there. So the healing process, got pretty ugly, but in the midst
Hmm.
of it, this beautiful thing happened. Even though I was exiled and removed from families, multiple families, everybody I'd ever known in my life, and basically abandoned by people who I thought were my people.
Yeah.
I found somebody who I'd known for so long. He'd always been there, that we are now married. And I never thought I was capable of a healthy relationship. I was one of these people that thought, oh, I'm broken, I'm damaged, all this. I
Hmm.
don't like that kind of self talk. I'm not broken, I'm affected, but it doesn't make
Sure.
me any less deserving of any less than a full life. So I am
Yes.
working on getting my next two books out by the end of this year. I'm wrapping up
Oh, I
the one
love
about
it.
my childhood actually in the next few days. So hopefully we'll see it by the end of the summer. And then I'll have the sequel to Gasping for Air hopefully come out after that by the end of the year, which talks about, how I was able to move on and heal. And there was still another narcissist that came along, somebody I didn't see coming. You'd think I could
Yeah.
detect them by now, but they're very
No, they're sneaky.
sneaky. They really are. Somebody I knew for 16 years, and boy, she just tried to sabotage. She liked me better when I was suffering, apparently.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
there's a story that in the midst of this healing and in the midst of this exile and in the midst of having this beautiful relationship and I'm getting married, that this person that I thought was for me really wasn't. And boy, that's just a juicy story in itself, even if it's
Yeah.
not about abuse. But there's a lot there. And then I've spoken in a few summits. I hope to. There's a lot of people who feel like I should do a TED talk. So I think once I'm
Yeah.
done with my books and I can focus on speaking, that's kind of the direction I'm going. And I've got YouTube channels. Everybody thinks I should just keep talking, talking, talking. So I
Yeah.
guess
Yeah.
that's what I will do. I will stop writing at some point and just talk, talk, talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, okay. So my last question for you is mostly for my audience. How can people find you?
Absolutely. I would say go to my website, danasdiaz.com, DANASDIAZ.com. Links for Facebook and Instagram are on there. I post every single day. And it's not all dark, awful stuff. I know people
Yeah.
expect that, like on Wednesday Addams or something, although she's pretty
Yeah.
cool. But we put funny stuff on there because we have to laugh sometimes. There's
Oh,
informational
for
stuff.
sure.
This podcast will certainly be on my website with any other interviews I've done. So I just have a broad variety of things that people can get information about. Link to my book is also on there, though most people just go straight to Amazon. You can grab that in
Yeah.
ebook or print. And just look for me. I do book signings all the time. I should have some coming up this summer. So probably just in the States, probably more in the Midwest, but we'll see. I might go to Vancouver, it sounds like, or maybe New
Oh,
York.
fun.
So I'll stop wherever I can and want people to come and see me. So please follow me and check
I
me out.
I love it. And I will be sure to include all the links in the show notes for everyone. But thank you so much for coming to talk with me and to share your story. It is so helpful and valuable. I know it is going to change someone's life.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Hey, hey, my friend. Thank you for listening today and for leaving a review. Those reviews mean so much to me and they help this podcast grow. I just love reading them. So if you haven't left one yet, please do. Now listen, are you having your own start again moment? If If your next chapter is filled with uncertainty, my new Start Again guide will get you pointed in the right direction. You can download your free guide today at shaunalee.com/startagain.